Welcome to the Architecture Corner. My name is Artmann and I'm your host at this show. Today we have two guests, Wikstrand and Joakim Lindbom from Capgemini in Sweden. Welcome Joakim and Gregor. Today we are going to talk about the new license model for GPL. You have written a little bit about it the last few days, Joakim. Could you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, well, it's not actually a new model itself, but rather what has been going on is that there's a progress in the GPL licensing, going from very strict and very firm ways of describing dependencies between source code and open source code over to a very soft dependency that when you are dependent, regardless of how you're dependent, you will come to an obligation to share. And this is nothing really strange in itself. It's the entire basis for open source and GPL has been the obligation to share. So that's not strange. The point is that I would say that most organizations using GPL code, they are not aware of it. They don't know what to do.
In general, I think it's a good idea to use open source because, for instance, when your organization grows or you move to other countries and so on, it's so much easier to if you're using open source tools. You don't have to worry about do I have one person over the limit, 10 persons over the limit, because it's always okay. There is no limit on how much staff you have, or there's no geographical limit on using the licenses and so on. What happens to that?
Yeah, I agree totally. I mean, not only that, but also I would say that looking at the innovation pace in open source, normally you could see a much faster innovation pace rather than proprietary software. So I would say the reason for going open source is very good. But the point is that you could come to a situation where if you use code, which is open source, as part of your solution, you are obliged to share your source code. And that could be okay, as long as you're aware of it. I would say that, for instance, a bank using the GPL code, I wouldn't say that they are really prepared to share things which are their core corporate secrets buried down into the code.
What will happen if they don't share it and there is an audit and they find out that they have broken the license?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's traditionally has been happening, and this has been going on for like 20 years, is that when you find a breach in the sharing, the corporate owner would do either the owner itself or via some kind of organization would require you to share the code. And most of the time, organizations, they take out the GPL code, they simply stop using it and use something else, and that's of course a cost in that, or they share the code. That's been going on for quite long. But what has been going on now for the last few years is actually people seeking litigation and actually seeking money. They want to be paid for it. So it has come to a point where when breaking an open source license, not only there is a hidden cost in it, but there is an external, very visible and quite high cost of it.
When we think of open source software, we might think that there is some idealist doing it in their spare time, but in fact much open source software is actually used by large corporations and produced by large corporations. For instance, Android is based on Linux, which is based on open source. Apple has an operating system that is based on open source.
Yeah.
So open source is not some friendly guy sitting up in his university dorm. It's really big corporations behind it.
Indeed. Looking at the Linux core, for instance, it's more than 10,000 participators, and most of those are paid by major corporations, for sure.
So what will the next step be then?
I would say that the next step for major corporations using open source would be to make sure that you know what you're doing.
Have you come across this concept of FOSS in, FOSS out? Free and open source software in, free and open software out. It is a process where when you want to onboard an open source module or other free module, you have a review with the technical team, the procurement team, and legal team to make sure that you understand what the license is and what it implies for you, and will I go into a bad situation or not. And I met quite a few lawyers who are specialized in free and open source software, and I would really recommend that you would go and talk to one of these lawyers before you commit on using open source software, and especially that you don't just add it because it's convenient, that you really think about it. I mean, even if it's open source software, it's a supplier, just like any other supplier, needs to be treated like a supplier.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. I would say that your question, no, I don't see it too often, and that's a problem. I have seen it, I've been actually doing it myself, but most organizations are simply adding open source software too low an organization. It's a programmer, it's a developer, it's some small team taking a decision and simply not informing or even discussing it with anybody else. And that's a major problem.
So the first step, I guess, would be to set a policy that we don't do this without decisions. We think about what we do before we do it when it comes to open source software, because the licenses are so different. It's like there's the GPL that we talked about, but there are other licenses like the Apache license, for instance, that is quite different.
Indeed, yeah.
And some of these licenses, like the GPL, is designed to make sharing bigger, and other licenses like the Apache licenses are designed to make it easier for you to use what they are sharing.
Yeah, indeed. I even actually did a survey last year an investigation at a small company, and we found out they were using something like 15 to 20 different open source components in different ways. And actually, a few of those licenses were incompatible. They were not allowed to be used in common. So even though they technically can go together, the licenses could clash. And we see that.
On my blog, I use Creative Commons licensed images because I don't know, they're very good images, and sharing them, I think, is good, and they improve my blog. And the new Creative Commons license, they have made their terms more lenient. It used to be that you would immediately lose the license if you didn't follow the terms, and now they've added a notice period.
Yeah.
Have you seen something like that in open source licenses?
Not in the licenses, but I would say that in reality, what we are seeing is that when there is a breach, you normally get this notice. You get a period to fix things, and the normal requirement is to fix it by sharing your code. And that's the most common way of solving it, of course. But the problem is that sometimes you can go into situations where the code that you should share is covering things that you really don't want to share. And then you have a real problem. And how do you do that? Would you technically remove the open source components? Well, that could be a small thing. If it's a small library, if it's something you use in development only, it's easy to take out. But if it's something which goes deep down into runtime, it is perhaps part of your data storage, which you have been using open source software, and in a way you can't do it, then it's a major thing. You need to re-engineer your entire solution. You simply don't do that in a short time.
It sounds to me like you're describing a situation where business rules are sprinkled out throughout the software, and that's what creates the vulnerability.
Yeah, indeed.
Because normal things that you do in your software aren't that interesting or secret, or usually there are just a few parts.
Indeed, the vast majority is absolutely no problem at all to share. But the point is that if you don't have an architecture which takes care of this, then it will be sprinkled out, and it will be wherever. You simply can't see where it is. But if you have an architecture where you have taken those parts which are real corporate secret and placed those into components which are more or less independent from the rest, then you're in a much better situation. Then you can take them out, you can share parts of your solution without any risk, and that's okay. But that goes back to when using open source software, you need an architect which actually knows what he or she is doing.
And a lawyer.
And a lawyer.
So if I understand you correct, if you're writing a piece of code that is using open software with the new licenses, you have to share that code.
It's not that simple. You might have to share it.
Yeah, you might have to share it. But if you make a proprietary interface, a component that the open software that you share uses, then you don't need to share it.
Still, it depends. It's not that simple. It goes back to which license are you using. Are you using the Ferret licenses, the GPL licenses, the Berkeley licenses, and so on? Which license family are you using? That's the first thing. And the second thing is that going back if we take GPL as an example, the earlier versions of GPL, version 1 and version 2, they were very much based on the C language and what you can do in the C language. And from that point, adding what has happened the last 20 years or so in technology, it has come to a point where you have technical freedom to do much things you couldn't do in C. But actually, the GPL licenses are progressing to a point to cover up what the actual intention of GPL2 and C, that the same intention will be valid also for newer technology. And that means that simply taking your code, put it in a DLL library beside everything else, which you can do today, which is okay, most likely will not be okay tomorrow, because if there is a runtime dependency, regardless of how that dependency is implemented, there is a dependency, and dependency thing itself is what makes you obliged to share.
Will these issues with the new license models make companies more resilient to use open source?
I think it's a bit like this. Most companies are very, very immature when it comes to open source software. They don't really have a strategy for when to use open source and when to not use open source, and they might not even have been thinking about the benefits of sharing some of their own software. Why is it that you want to keep some software proprietary? Well, it's to protect your business secrets, but things that are common to your business in general or your sector, then it could be a big advantage if you and your competitors and other people can contribute to make things better, like Eclipse.
Indeed, and there are already in some sectors we see open source software which is actually going up into the application space. There are ERP systems based on open source today and so on, and that's exactly what Greg is saying here. When it's non-competitive parts of your business, actually that is a huge benefit of actually supplying your solutions to the market in an open source software. You will get help to develop it. You will get help to progress your software. And if you're first, if you're the initiator of something, you would come to a situation in the market where you actually have a competitive advantage in doing this. So absolutely, when there is non-competitive areas, there is lots and lots of reason, both cost and innovation, where you should use it rather than using something else.
And should participate.
And participate, exactly.
Not just use it, but participate. And it's like if you have 100 developers working on your proprietary software, and if instead you have 10 and another company has 10 and so on, and you
Indeed.
still have 100 developers, but you're only spending a tenth of the cost.
Yeah, indeed. And also part of the open source model or the free and open source model is that there is some kind of competition. There is nobody saying that this is the only way of doing things. If you supply, say, a transportation module for your transportation package, and somebody else comes up with something better, there will be a battle. The best solution would win. I mean, so if there are many suppliers doing things, you could either improve on small things in what is there, or actually replacing it with something vast better. And this kind of competition is something that you would gain for. You would get access to better modules, better solutions, better algorithms over time, without actually doing them yourself. But by playing that game, you would get a large advantage.
So, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts about the new license models.
Thank you.
Thank you.